I mentioned earlier today that one of the key partners in putting together the Congress of Business is the University of Glasgow. And this, of course, is Glasgow's historic university. Many of you know the university and espouse it in just the way that I do. So it's a great pleasure to introduce the Principal and the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Glasgow, Professor Sir Anton Muscatelli.
Thanks, Greg. Thank you. Well, thank you, Greg, for that very kind introduction. And it's a real pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to be here for this inaugural Congress of Business event. I've said this many times, even during COP26, but I think it's worth restating today because I think there's a reason why Glasgow has the potential as a city to pave the way for the just transition to net zero. It's because our city has already embraced change throughout the centuries, and we're here today in this fantastic engine works, which is a symbol of our industrial heritage, but also of the recent transformation. We've thrived from industrialization, but of course, industrialization is the problem that we're now living with. And in fact, Glasgow was one of the first cities in the world to declare a climate emergency, and so did my institution, the University of Glasgow. We were the first university in Scotland to declare a climate emergency. And I want to say a bit today about what we're trying to do, both as an organization in our own right, but also as an engine of research and innovation, because we do face, as Gary Kendall has already pointed out, an existential crisis. So this is really, really complicated now, given where we've got ourselves in terms of our path to net zero. So, like many organizations, we've set our own Glasgow Green strategy, setting an ambitious target for decarbonisation, trying to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030. How we're going to do that is essentially, in part, by reducing our Scope 1 and Scope 2 carbon footprint by 2030 by over 50% compared to 10 years earlier, in part by looking for local decarbonisation type activities, which take us to the remaining 50%. We are a large organisation. We are around 1 billion turnover, and so our commitment to net zero, I think, matters for the city and indeed for the UK as a whole. And if you think of our total impact on the UK economy, it's worth about 4.4 billion. We have around 11,000 employees. So what we do in this space really does matter. We are a signatory to the Sustainable Glasgow Green Economy Hub Charter, and last year we launched an important project called Gallant, and Professor Jamie Toney, who actually leads that, is with us today, so please do speak to Jamie about the project. It's essentially about £10 million, which comes from the UKRI, Natural Environment Research Council. And what we're doing with that is we're working with Glasgow City Council and a consortium of partners from industry, the public sector and communities to use the city as a living lab to test sustainable solutions. We're looking at key issues such as active travel, decarbonisation of heating, and flood risk within the city. And like all of you, we understand that we have a real duty to address how we do business in the context of the climate emergency. As I said, we've introduced our own carbon management plan. We're looking across the board at how we can reduce carbon emissions from business travel to our estate development and to our supply chains. But as a university, it's not only what we do as an organization which matters. As I said, there is an important element of what we do in research and innovation, as well as addressing the skills agenda and our wider societal role. That also matters. And if I can don my economist hat for a moment, I'm an economist by training, apart from the leadership role that I have at Glasgow. It is the most radical economic transition that we've ever made in peacetime. And again, Gary pointed out very clearly that this is a complex behavioral and cultural issue. This is not tinkering at the edges with one or two interventions. We have to reshape our financial systems. We have to rethink about how we trade. We've just heard about what we have to do around the circular economy to establish supply chains in a more sustainable way. And in Scotland's case, I think striking that balance of sustainable economic growth and increased productivity with the commitments we've made to achieve a just and fair net zero will be key, because it's more difficult to persuade people of cultural change unless you can actually try to do this in a way that is just, but also isn't simply about redistribution. And I've said before as an economist, environmental and economic priorities can't be conflicting in this space, otherwise we won't achieve that cultural change. They are symbiotic. It will be the green, clean and emerging technologies of the future that will allow us to reach our full economic potential, and it's how to pivot towards that. Many of our global economies, of course, are still too heavily reliant on fossil fuels. We saw the carbon budget. That is one of the scariest graphs that I certainly have seen before, especially if we wanted to have a real probability of staying within the Paris commitments. Frankly, even if you go for 2 degrees, it looks pretty scary anyway. So frankly, we don't have much time left. So if I look at the kind of research and innovation that my university does, it is about investing in our new technologies, such as we're working in areas like quantum semiconductors, 5G, 6G sensing technologies, and clean energy solutions. And let me give you just a couple of examples where these technologies matter for net transition. For instance, sensors and imaging techniques are key to managing greenhouse emissions, such as methane leakage. As another example, earlier this month, we announced the establishment of a new hydrogen innovation center with industry partner TÜV Süd in East Kilbride to accelerate the development of hydrogen technologies from experimental proof of concept stage right to small prototype stage. And we have gained about £1 million from the Scottish Government's Hydrogen Innovation Scheme for another 3 projects, which will see us work with the likes of Glasgow Airport, the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult at Strathclyde University, and Clyde Hydrogen Systems Limited, which is a company recently spun out by researchers from our School of Chemistry to look at new ways of hydrogen production, storage and distribution. And as we've heard, institutions and industry alike are not moving fast enough. Moving faster requires collaboration. And on a positive note, in Glasgow, we're already taking the right steps to work collectively together. As I've given you some example and work with industry, another example is work that we're doing with SSE Energy Solutions in jointly funding PhD research within the university into the performance of renewable technologies in the business sector, looking at state-of-the-art digital twin technology to identify gaps in performance and routes to improvement. And similarly, our colleagues from our Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence are working with a Glaswegian architectural firm and the city government to sustainably retrofit old tenement stocks for use of social housing. One of the biggest problems is what we do around heat, particularly in old stock of housing. And the same centre has been working also on looking at how we can plug the gaps compared to neighbouring countries when it comes to the adoption of heat pumps and other technologies. I do actually feel that collaboration is accelerating. I do think that what the climate emergency demands is that we look beyond our traditional silos to get behind these technologies together, academia, government, industry, to make the changes at pace. And I do think it's shifting. And it's not purely for the benefit of universities. The externalities of universities are huge. If you look at OECD data, you'll see that more than 2.5 million of European Patent Office patent applications for 35 OECD countries and China sees 50% of that inventive activity by industry occurring within a 30-kilometer distance from a research university. So we're absolutely part of that solution. And it's not just about STEM. It really isn't just about STEM technologies. The arts, humanities, and social sciences also do matter, given that these are behavioral changes that we're trying to engender. Our social scientists, for instance, can help us understand consumer behavior. We heard about food waste, actually, a moment ago. Some of my colleagues in the Adam Smith Business School have been evaluating the demand for fast fashion on Buchanan Street. Later today, you'll hear from my colleague, Professor John Crawford, who's in the audience as well, on his work as part of the Global Soil Health Programme. Again, a hugely important area which could really make a big impact on that remaining carbon budget. But of course, the opportunity to learn from universities, I think, is broader than research. One area which is absolutely vital in achieving net zero is skills. Skills are key for sustainable competitiveness, productivity, and resilience. We've looked at Glasgow, the University of Glasgow, we've introduced changes in the curriculum to ensure that all our students are exposed to carbon literacy and climate change so that they leave knowing the vital role that they can play in their lives, in their careers. And we also offer a suite of micro-credential courses on carbon literacy and sustainable decision-making, and I'd urge all industry colleagues to make use of these. We're also open to expanding these micro courses to plug the gaps for workers in specific sectors. So again, very happy to hear suggestions of how we can do that with your organizations. And our universities also have significant convening power. Ensuring a just transition requires that we don't leave marginalized communities behind. At home, this has seen our institution championing positive change on a local, citywide scale. Our Centre for Sustainable Solutions, which Professor Tony directs, has researchers looking at a series of green recovery dialogues between practitioners, council officials, businesses, policymakers and researchers in the city, with a focus on challenge areas such as urban housing and heating. And globally, as one of the UK's top universities, we are working with our global partners through important networks. We are members of the Guild of European Research Intensive Universities. We've signed an agreement with the African Research Universities Alliance to try and share knowledge and best practice. And one area of that is the drive to net zero, where we're setting up clusters of excellence with the African Research Universities Alliance and our European partners. This is not about the global north leading the global south. This is about working in partnership. There is no solution to the net zero problem which doesn't involve continents such as Africa. And above all, to reflect real change, we must recognize that the commitments that we make must be long-term and sustainable. We know young people want to attend universities that are driving the environmental agenda forward. Now the challenge, I think, is to scale that great work from the progressive to a standard that is standard procedure for all. And I want to talk beyond climate change. I mean, I remember at the time of COP26, I chaired a meeting involving some senior politicians, which dealt with the issue of how actually it's not just about climate change, it is about biodiversity. COP15 is was just as important as COP26. There is no route out of this without the biodiversity, meeting the biodiversity challenge. And because of that interconnectedness between different aspects of sustainable development, which Gary Kendall again pointed out, we are looking at ways in which we can work much more as a university to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These date back to 2015. It's a more broad portfolio than simply climate change. And we're trying to see how we can best align our university to that. Increasingly, there are ways in which universities are being assessed which look at that. The Times Higher Education Organization now releases annual impact rankings to assess how we perform as universities against our pledges to implement the United Nations SDGs. And we were delighted that Glasgow took part in these rankings last year for the first time, and we ranked 19th in the world for our contribution. Particularly in areas like SDG 11, where we were placed second globally on the sustainable cities and communities, which is around making cities and human settlements more inclusive, safe and sustainable. And in the next 8 days, we'll see the latest rankings, which will be published, and we'll see how we've performed as a university. But this is really important. Students really care about this. Our other stakeholders really care about this. And it's not just about climate change. There are many other dimensions of sustainable developments that we have to address. So before coming here today, I was asked by the organizers to speak on what I see as the role and legacy for universities in the COP process. And let me conclude just by summarizing this in 5 brief points. First, it is about our research and capacity for innovation. And I do think in universities like my own, it is world-class. We are a nation of inventors, thinkers, and creatives. But we must properly fund our institutions and world-class researchers to unlock and drive that research. There are still gaps there around proof of concept funding. There are still gaps there around properly funding research and innovation in this country. And governments have to step up to that. Secondly, we can provide the education, upskilling, and reskilling required to meet the needs for a just transition. And as I said from the outset, this will require input from industry, and we are willing to work together with industry to do this. Thirdly, knowledge exchange. There's much our researchers can share with government, industry, and our academic partners around the world, but there's much that we can learn from you all too. Universities as anchor institutions in our communities are important interlocutors. And again, I really want to stress the role that our students play. I mentioned our Glasgow Green 2030 strategy. That was far less ambitious until our students basically demanded that we be more ambitious. And again, it's that kind of action that is important in driving our organizations to be even better. And fourth, we must use our convening power and advocate for focused government leadership across the globe. We heard about private finance, the importance of GFANs and similar initiatives across the world. Finance is absolutely key to this. Without private finance, we're not going to get there, despite the many interventions happening at the moment, from the Inflation Reduction Act to what Europe and the UK are thinking, and many other industrialized countries are doing around the world. But really, the challenge is absolutely massive, so it does require action in that finance space. And finally, and above all, partnership. We've already heard that, partnership, collaboration. Universities must leverage their partnerships with each other, with government, with industry and communities to effect sustainable change. And perhaps the Congress for Business in Glasgow may wish to think about what we could do to join up with other COP host cities and leverage the fantastic research and knowledge exchange potential available. So look forward, Greg, to a conversation on this, but again, thank you for listening.
Anton, if I may, firstly, thank you very much for such a comprehensive and thorough analysis of the role of the university in this decarbonisation pathway. And you ended with the suggestion, which I think will be widely welcomed, that universities in COP hosting cities can be part of this broader alliance of stakeholders within those cities that are really going to tackle these things together. And COP hosting cities can be, as we were saying right at the start, pioneers and innovators, and it certainly seems University of Glasgow is doing that. I won't repeat what you said, but you clearly went through the role of the university as a corporate entity with its land, its buildings, its employees, its procurement, its whole supplier system. You went through the role of the university in R&D and technology and really at the frontiers of science. You talked very compellingly about the teaching dimensions of all of that, and particularly the engagement of the right kinds of programs, and the list of programs that you went through is phenomenal. You answered about 6 of the questions that are here in the Slido immediately. But you also talked about this central role of engagement with the students, which I thought was absolutely fascinating, and the role of the students in setting and accelerating the agenda and really pushing it forward. So we won't go into all of that. There are 3 questions that have been mentioned by people in the audience that are sort of relevant here. So question number 1 was, are the universities actually teaching circularity as a kind of new way of thinking about our economy?
So that's a really good question. As I said, we're doing a lot on carbon literacy, and circularity is part of that. But I do wonder, given the importance, and as we've just heard, of circularity to our own behaviors, whether we should do more around that, and then trying to bring it down to, what difference can you make at the individual level? Because again, that is what we're trying to do with many of these micro-credential courses, is trying to affect individual behavior. Because again, as we saw, that's what it's about. It's a cultural change we're trying to affect. So probably we may not be doing enough, and I wonder whether we should look particularly at how individuals can play their role in the circular economy.
Okay, well, then there may be more to do there. And then there was a question from Patrick McCarthy, thank you, Patrick, which was all about hydrogen. People's ears pricked up when you spoke about the R&D that's happening at the university on hydrogen. The simple question is, do you think there's scope for us to really develop a hydrogen economy in Glasgow and the west of Scotland?
Gosh, well, first of all, I'm an economist and I'm not a technologist, so I could be getting this wildly wrong. So this is all what I learned from my colleague. So I do think hydrogen has an important role, simply because although there are probably more economical sources of renewable energy, we do still face a storage and base load problem. So I think hydrogen can be part of that. It needs to be clearly much more efficient, and this is why we have all these projects to try and get that storage and efficiency of production right. Clearly not as easy as it is in countries where you have different kinds of renewable energy, but I think it is possible. I think it probably has to play a role, particularly given the difficulties around some other energy storage solutions, I suspect it will have an important role. But there'll be some scientists and engineers here telling me that I've got this wrong.
Yeah, well, or telling you that there's an even better answer,
Yes,
perhaps.
possible,
And if they wish to, they can put those onto Slido. You don't have to ask questions. You can make comments. And then Sarah O'Donnell asked a very interesting question, Anton. She asked whether we're placing enough attention on adaptation as well as mitigation. And I wonder if there's something that the university's been thinking about itself.
So yes, we are doing a lot of work in adaptation, and it's absolutely essential because we do know that there's already a high probability. We saw it in the reports published in the last few days. There's already a high probability that we will exceed the 1.5 degree Paris climate commitment, and we know that above that there are some really difficult solutions. We're doing work, for instance, around coastal erosion in Southeast Asia. We're doing work around other issues of trying to preserve biodiversity because, as I said, we know what a challenge that is and how that can provide a real acceleration. One of the things we are trying to, on the back of COP26, to explore is whether we can do more in terms of training for adaptation in marginalized communities around the world. And a lot of our work in low and middle income countries is essentially about that. These countries face the most, if we think our problems are serious from climate change, these countries face catastrophic change.
And it was amazing, Anton, both in what you said, but also in what I'm aware of from the sheer range of ways in which the university is engaging with different communities and nations around the world on those issues. Fantastic. I think one more question, if we may. You right at the end of your remarks, you talked about the universities in other COP hosting cities. Are you already engaging with them, and is there the beginnings of a network or an agenda there?
So we are absolutely in the nations that have hosted COPs. We already have partnerships, as you would expect, given the size and profile of Glasgow. We already have relationships in countries like Egypt with UAE, and of course in countries like France and Denmark, which have hosted COP before. So we are absolutely already engaged with universities, however, not explicitly around the COP theme. And this is why I do wonder whether there is a possibility here, perhaps working with our cities as well, because there is both a civic and a university dimension. And it may be interesting to see what we can do around COP legacy in partnership.
Great. Well, something for you and Susan to pick up, I think, later or on another occasion. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Professor Sir Anton Muscatelli.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you.